We have with us Dante Disparte, the Vice Chair and Head of Policy and Communications at Libra Association. Julia Friedlander, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Global Economics and Business Program at Atlantic Council and formerly Director of the European Union, Southern Europe and Economic Affairs at the National Security Council, building on her time at the US Treasury. And Chanwei David Zhou, Chief Economist of Weinxian Blockchain and formerly at the China Investment Corporation. And David has been researching China's fintech sector since 2012. So for a discussion on digital currencies, we couldn't dream of a better mix of perspectives as these three panelists who are familiar with the private sector, the US government, and Chinese government efforts, respectively. For the audience, thank you to many of you who pre-submitted questions for the panel, which I've tried to incorporate into the discussion already. As you listen to the conversation, you can submit additional questions through the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screens there, and I'll bring those in as well. As you probably heard, the session is being recorded and will be available on our website at belfercenter.org. So with that, let me get into the conversation. And I wanted to start with you, David. So after 5 years of research, the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, has recently unveiled the digital currency electronic payments, the DCEP project in China, which is currently being piloted in 4 cities, and their aspirations to make this used domestically in a widespread fashion by the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing, which are slated in 2022. So can you start off by giving us a sense of how is the digital currency electronic payments pilot in China different from Bitcoin and some of the cryptocurrencies that folks might be familiar with? And why is this pilot such a big deal?
Okay, and thanks for having me here. So the digital currency of China is basically a liability of the central bank. So it has all the sovereign support. So if you look at how the digital yuan is issued, so first for Chinese commercial banks needs to use their deposit reserve at the central bank to essentially buy the digital currency from the Chinese central bank and in a wholesale approach. And then Chinese people and companies can use cash or deposit to buy digital currency from the commercial banks. So if you look at the issuance and the redemption process of the digital yuan, it's driven by the market demand. It's not settled by algorithm like cryptocurrency. So if you look at the cryptocurrency such as Bitcoin, so the supply is determined by algorithm, right? And it has no intrinsic value. So I think there is a huge difference between these two types of currencies. So if you look at the technology they used, Bitcoin used blockchain is a public permissionless blockchain. But the Chinese digital currency, even it follows the token, it's a token, but it's not a token in a distributed ledger. It's a token inside a centralized ledger. So in technology, it's very different. So that's why Bitcoin is anonymous. Everyone can own and use Bitcoin. But for the people to own and use digital yuan, they need to go through a KYC, know your customer process. So they're very different from each other, actually. And the pilot program I think is very important because the Chinese central bank has started this digital currency program since 2014. So they have built a prototype around 2017. They have studied all its implication on monetary and on money and payment system in China, and what technology should be used.
Yeah.
I think for the theoretical, if you look at the study and the theoretical study, it's very the digital yuan has go through a very thorough, very solid process. But we need to understand how it works in the real world,
Yeah.
and what are people is real demand for the digital yuan. So that's why I think the digital the pilot program in the 4 cities in China is very important.
Yeah.
So,
and we'll get to some of those use cases. Thanks, David.
Yeah.
So Julia, on the US side, the US government has been researching the digital dollar, but I think it's fair to say that it's been relatively slow compared to China and to some European nations. Is there a momentum now to explore the digital dollar? And what might be driving some of those shifts? Is it the fact that China and Libra, which we're about to get to, is making progress? Is it some of these conversations about COVID-19 and getting stimulus payments to Americans, or are there other reasons?
I think it's both. I'll start with the current COVID situation. I think what we're realizing that is that the issues of income disparity and inequality and access to the financial system in the U.S. is actually a national security concern, the concerns about being able to issue remittances has been a serious problem for us, as well as I think as you alluded to, actually dispersing the loans that people were eligible for under the CARES Act. We had to work with our regulations to actually loosen them a little bit to allow commercial banks to be able to issue those loans. And so I think, I was talking to a couple of colleagues earlier today that were saying that, the COVID crisis has actually put the discussion in the United States into overdrive. And I think that that's evident by Chairman Powell's recent statement saying that we really needed to get started on this and it had to do it as a central bank effort. And certainly discussions that we've been having with the public sector as well. The second, of course, is competition, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that, and this is a concern that's specifically of interest to the United States, given its traditional role as having the dollar as a global reserve currency, and all of the obligations and opportunities that provides. I think you have to be play with the sector you're in, and if the global market, whether it be whatever country it is driving the conversation, you want to be in the position to set the regulatory involvement and not be left as not interoperable. So I think that is seeing the developments, regardless of any geopolitical tensions, right? I remain agnostic on that, especially on this panel. It's a question of remaining with the times.
Yeah. Julia, you mentioned Fed Chair Powell's statement about the central bank being the only organization that should be working on the digital dollar. Dante, I wanted to ask you about that. Should private entities help design and research and develop the digital dollar and other currencies? And what is the model for public-private partnership on that front?
Sure. Well, thanks, Aditi, and I'm really grateful to you and to the Belfer Center for pulling together this conversation. It's very timely for all of the reasons that we've already heard and many more. Look, I think the direction of travel is digital, but it's not digital at the exclusion of traditional models. I've always thought of, the breakthrough innovation that blockchain can enable, particularly when it comes to payments, is to increase optionality. And I think we're starting to see a conversation emerge around public-private opportunities that recognize the need for that type of optionality. I mean, the public sector should always have oversight over monetary policy, over issues to do with, how infinite is the ceiling of liability that a central bank should have, and how to maintain the geopolitics and geoeconomics and all these other issues relating to a currency are, of course, a public sector domain. But then when you think about these very stubborn issues around last mile frictions, around 1.7 billion people completely excluded from the formal economy, and while there are many very good reasons for that to be the case, technology should not be one of them. And the unwillingness of the private and public sectors to collaborate and build new forms of financial inclusion, new forms of solutions that can drive down cost on critical issues like cross-border payments and remittances. And then very much the pandemic has underscored that this is also an a developed country reality as well, with the inability to make fast payments a reality for hundreds of millions of people around the world and millions of Americans as well. it just underscores that this is a problem big enough for cross-border, cross-sector collaboration and uncommon coalitions to be formed around it.
Yeah. Dante, I want to stay with you on Libra for just a second. So the initial white paper that came out on Libra last year talked about a token that would be backed by a basket of currencies. And the recent version of that paper that the Libra Association published has changed that plan. And so now we're talking about multiple tokens, each backed by a single currency. So can you talk a little bit about that change and what that implies for monetary policy, geopolitical implications, and some of the things you were mentioning there?
Sure. So the updated white paper, which was just issued in April, is really born in no small measure from a series of conversations that we have had with central bankers and with a range of other stakeholders around the world over the last 12 months. And one of the items we've heard loud and clear is that, you know, the ability of the network to be upgradable and to support single currency stablecoins is an important priority, in no small measure because it would increase domestic use cases. It would increase the type of applicability that Julia referred to a moment ago with, for example, issuing stimulus payments in the future might be an easier opportunity if these types of open payment networks existed. At the same time, we haven't entirely abandoned the concept of the multi-currency Libre coin. If anything, it has echoes of the special drawing rights at the IMF and the idea of having a neutral, low volatility instrument that might serve as a cross-border settlement instrument, or that might serve for people whose currencies are not yet on the network. Again, as a low volatility instrument is an important design feature. But there too, our view is that that type of structure and the weighting of that type of multi-currency structure should be something that's being designed with international stakeholders at the table as well. So as you know, the Libra system is really pursuing a regulated pathway to not only enabling and activating the payment system, but also to all facets of the economics of the project. We really want to ensure a lot of alignment with international stakeholders. So we're working closely with the Financial Stability Board, our regulator, among others, to get that design right.
At the risk of getting a little wonky here, if you do that and you have several tokens, each backed by a single currency, so you have the dollar-based Libre token, for example, how do you prevent dollarization or currency substitutions where people just start using the dollar in emerging markets where there's less trust in their own currency?
Yeah, you know, and so of course it is a very wonky and very lengthy subject to get into to really do it justice. I think one item that's really important is, of course, the Libre payment system overall and the pathway for users to get access to this will flow through regulated channels, right? So if a country has currency controls in place and others, then the network would abide by those standards. But we also must remember the need, right? That globally, more than 50% of the world's adult populations are subject to hyperinflationary domestic currency environments. And in the case of remittances, remittance inflows coming from stronger currencies entering different countries around the world are an important pathway for foreign exchange to enter the country. And you know, on a purchasing power basis, it also produces better purchasing outcomes for people around the world as well. But we're being thoughtful about issues to do with capital controls, with the economics of this. And again, the network will flow through regulated entities throughout so that the on-ramp and the off-ramps are respecting respective rules and regulations, including issues around economics and capital.
Okay. Julia, let me go back to you. So how will the US government approach regulating something like Libra or other private sector tokens that may come down the pipeline, especially given our financial regulatory system is so fragmented? And now in the case of Libre, at least, it's a Swiss-based organization. And so how do we manage something like this?
You know, bit by bit. I mean, I will first, as someone coming out of the Treasury Department, admit that the regulatory environment is very complex. It took me a long time to understand it myself. You know, but it's a reflection of the broad range of financial services and role that the United States plays in the global economy and to its customers. I think what we would say is that we'd like to remain, for the time being, tech agnostic. So depending upon the underlying financial service that is being provided, it would be regulated by the appropriate regulator. So if you're essentially issuing a security, it would be the SEC. If you are providing money transfer services, it's essentially serving as a money service business, then you're going to be regulated by FinCEN at the federal level, and then at the state level individually. And then obviously by the OCC and others if you're serving as providing banking services, pure banking services. And so, you know, I understand it is a little bit piecemeal, but you know, the idea is, you know, I think that, you know, speaking with my regulatory colleagues, you know, we're always trying to keep up with the Joneses in terms of the technological developments, right? So if there's a very, you know, the private sector is often much more dynamic than the government, of course. But the idea is to try to not have to reinvent the wheel every single time an adjustment is made by a private service provider. So there could be hiccups in the short term, of course, and there have been already. But over the longer term, we're looking for sort of a more continuity in the field.
And do you think the Fed, the Federal Reserve, will lead on this in coordinating these efforts?
You know, I don't know. I think ultimately, yes. That would be my bet right now, in collaboration with the Treasury Department.
David, let me go back to you. So far, the PBOC has talked about having the digital yuan be in ubiquitous use domestically by 2022. Yeah. But does China have cross-border aspirations for its currency? And what are the implications of that in your view?
Yes, so actually the current pilot program and will cover foreign visitors when Beijing holds the Winter Olympics in 2022. And I think ultimately the Chinese government will promote the use of digital yuan in cross-border payment, because first, by nature of the technology, digital currency has the potential to revolutionize the cross-border payment. And so both the digital yuan and the Libre and other CBDCs see these potentials. The second, so since the late 2000s, the Chinese government has to internationalize the Chinese yuan. And we have built promote the use of Chinese yuan in international trade, cross-border investment, and the central bank reserve. I think the digital yuan will promote new tools for the renminbi internationalization. And for the implication, I don't think there are any significant geopolitical goals in the digital yuan programs. I think it's mostly is monetary and payment issues.
Yeah, let me ask you this without, again, getting too wonky on the tech side. Most global transactions right now pass through centralized infrastructure. So SWIFT, which is the messaging service, or the correspondent banking network, which is largely US dominated. Do digital currencies like the digital yuan come with technology that would disrupt that infrastructure and create a different infrastructure that US authorities do not have purview over?
I think this, so we need to understand these problems in 2 points. The first, so for the current cross-border payment infrastructures is based on bank account. The money flows through the account of correspondent banks and also the central banks. For digital currency is exists on a ledger, is a token. So it doesn't rely on any bank account. So if you look at the cross-border use of digital currency is peer-to-peer by nature. There will be no difference between domestic payment and cross-border payment or offshore payments regarding to digital currency. They're all in the same systems. So if you look at this point, it's a totally different and infrastructure for international finance. So theoretically speaking, it will rely less on SWIFT. So the second point is that, so if you the system of digital currency is not wholly independent from the current systems, because commercial banks play a very important role in the issuance and the redemption and the circulation of digital currencies. So the commercial bank is still subject to government regulations. And as I have mentioned, digital currency has a KYC process. It's not anonymous and permissionless.
But doesn't, Julia, maybe I can ask you this, but doesn't what David is describing undermine US government's and US Treasury's ability to track financial payments around the globe? And what implications does that have for our national security?
I think it's one of several things that that might impede our ability to understand what's going on at any given time. And that's why it's important to establish the strongest global standards as possible on this, and why actually the Chinese government has been leading in the Financial Action Task Force right now in a lot of the work that's underway on virtual currencies that, again, was overdue, and the guidance that was provided last year is not perfect and will be revised, but I think gives a global framework for that it's really, it's a question of international responsibility.
I wanted to bring in now Victor G, who is one of my research assistants on the Economic Diplomacy Initiative. At the Belfer Center, most of the work gets done by our amazing students, and Victor is certainly one of them. And he just graduated from our MPA program, Masters in Public Administration, focused on international development, and knows a lot about digital currencies. Victor, go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for sharing. I have two questions actually. First one is for David. What is your opinion that Libra is perceived in China? And as some experts in China claimed before, do you think it is an extension for the US government? Okay. I also find, sorry, I just build up on this. I also find a similar question from audience for Dante. Will the Libra be used to implement the US foreign policy like sanction? Also, what can China's DCEP affect on Libra?
Okay. Thanks, Victor. Maybe we'll start with David. Is Libra perceived as an extension of the US government in China?
No, yeah. So I think Chinese government understands the relationship between Facebook and the Libra Association and the US government. And I think they understand that Libre is a project not by private sectors, but under the regulation of the public sectors. And so because it involves lots of many currencies and many governments, and we have regulations on different parts of Libras. And among this government, of course, US government is the most important one. And we have followed, many people in China has followed the testimony and on Libra and very closely, yeah. And basically, we think it's a very important innovations in money and payment systems, and it's an endorsement of digital currency technology. So there are many Chinese government officials and give talk or write articles on Libras, and they want to study the impacts, Libra's impacts on cross-border payments and international finance. And we also think that Libra will have very deep implications on currency substitution and monetary sovereignty. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Dante, just building on what Victor said, the implementation of US financial sanctions through the dollar-based payment system has received a lot of pushback from other countries, particularly in the case of Iran. And recently, some of the hiring decisions that the Libra Association has made might compound those fears. And so you recently hired Stuart Levy as CEO, who was the first Deputy Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. You brought on Robert Werner as General Counsel, who's the Director of FinCEN and OFAC. So should other countries conclude from this that Libra is a dollar-based system that's going to be an arm of the US government in implementing its foreign policy priorities?
Yeah, well, so no, the short answer is no, because ultimately the project is a private sector initiative. It's a consortium-based initiative. Today we have 27 members of the organization. And what we're designing first and foremost is a payment system. I think the idea that a blockchain-based payment system, or for example, the entry of central bank digital currencies can exist without the delivery rails is where there's a bit of a disconnect in the dialogue. So, in a world in which CBDC existed, an open payment system like Libre, which again, the technology is open source, but at the same time, we have to ensure that we're answerable to a very high standard of regulation, consumer protection, privacy, and also all of the types of financial regulations that have been in place, anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism and otherwise. And so I think the ability for this project to succeed and for cryptocurrencies and digital currencies not to expose people to a lot of risks, which have been native to the sector for the last 11 years, we have to raise the standard. And so our hope is that as a payment system, it is widely interoperable, widely usable, and promotes vigorous competition around the edges. And that shouldn't come at the expense of compliance and a strong commitment to compliance, including a range of international standards.
Thanks, Dante. Thank you, Victor. I just want to pull in a question here from one of the audience members, and this is to all of the panelists. What does success look like for the Chinese digital currency, a future digital US dollar, and what is the envisioned role that Libra would want to play with both digital currencies? So maybe I'll start there with you, Dante. Can Libra coexist in a world where central banks have issued their own currencies?
Sure. Look, the short answer is one, I don't think this is an all or nothing, winner takes all sort of proposition, and nor do I think there's a standards war being waged here. If anything, a stable coin based model is really paying homage to the notion that, monetary policy and the underlying stable assets come from the public sector. And I do think of it as a bit of a bridge from an economics point of view that, a stable coin is being designed to pay and to borrow all of the intrinsic value and stability of the underlying assets that underpin it. I think the real breakthrough innovation here is to untether financial inclusion from brick and mortar. There's an enormously well-documented use case about the ability of mobile payment networks to drive a wedge on financial inclusion and lower cost. And this is what we're really trying to focus on building. And I think, back to Julia's points earlier, the pandemic has just underscored the need for these types of solutions to exist and to exist now. And the case for interoperability, the case for cross-border corridors that are peer-to-peer, that a payment system like this could do for basic banking and basic payments, what mobile messaging and other platforms have done for telephony. If telephony was still fixed to fixed line poles and wires, then there'd be billions of people on the margins of any access to communication. And I think we have a chance, a once in a generation chance, to do the same thing for basic financial inclusion. And so we shouldn't be terribly dogmatic about what's the best standard here. I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of innovation taking place at both the public and private sector to try to get this right.
Yeah. Julia, let me go to you for your comments on that. What does success look like for a digital economy in the US?
I think that it's going to be, I agree with Dante. I think it's going to be a question of both. When the markets settle and when we've established what role that digital currencies can and will play and exactly how we're going to regulate them, that there are going to be some sort of niches that are covered by certain areas of the economy. I think that there are there's a reason why you will use a small private sector organization such as MoneyGram to provide remittances, right? There's a certain dynamism that that comes from a private sector entity performing those services. I think that there's going to be a bit of a push and a pull here. But going back, I mean, I would like to sort of reassure everyone that we certainly from the U.S. government, we do not, my colleagues would never view Libra as any sort of instrument. I think. Having conversations is one thing, and having conversations with Swiss regulators is one thing. That's only like sort of part of our job. But ultimately, if you have top brass talent coming out of the U.S. government to go sort of inform those efforts, it just shows how seriously and how much credibility we give the instrument.
And David, let me go to you. What does success look like for the digital yuan? And let me tack on another question from an audience member. What use cases will drive rapid adoption of the cross-border Chinese digital currency?
Okay, yeah. So I think digital yuan will be a success. Yeah, it will succeed. And so China is very close to a cashless societies. And the Chinese people, I think, enjoy one of the most advanced and mobile payment services in the world. And the Chinese central bank has lots of experience And regarding the regulation and the promotion of payment technology, I think, and the digital yuan will build on both the user experience and the wide adoption of the mobile payments and the government regulatory framework, and to succeed. For the use case, let's just suppose foreign reporters come to Beijing in 2022, and so he doesn't need to have a Chinese bank account. It's very easy for him to go through a simple KYC process, to have a wallet for the digital yuans. And then in China, he can use the digital wallet and for mobile payment. And he can have some yuan even after he come back to his own countries. And while abroad, he can still use the digital yuan to transact with, for example, to buy some goods from the Chinese e-commerce company platforms. So I think there will be lots of use case for the cross-border use case for the digital yuan. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Julia, now let me go back to you, given your focus on European affairs before starting at the Atlantic Council recently. Do you think it's advisable for the US government to approach this alone, or should there be more coordination with our allies and partners in Europe? And Christine Lagarde has been at the forefront of some of these conversations. She's, at least before COVID-19 hit, had started a working group with 6 central banks, including Canada and Japan. Should the US be participating in efforts like that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that you can only be stronger in numbers. I mean, that's sort of the tenet of how we approach both macro and monetary global stability. I think given the inherent crossover between U.S. and European markets, and the strong financial regulatory relationship that we have with the European Union, and in every aspect of financial regulation, this doesn't only have to do with, obviously, banks and cross-border transaction flows, but really sort of the like-minded approach to transparency and to financial access. Absolutely. And I think that we're just getting started, and I very much appreciate the efforts by Christine Lagarde to sort of elevate that within the European Union. I think it's not going to be without its hiccups on the European side. I mean, the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area. There are, we've been encouraging capital markets union, depository insurance within the bloc for a long time, and I think this will play in sort of a catalyst role, perhaps, these conversations in sort of the broader Eurozone reform conversation, or at least that's my hope. But the ECB doesn't have full jurisdiction over the central banks of the member states, and so there are very different approaches towards the use of cash. For example, if I go back to Germany, I have to take cash out of the cash machine to do half of what I do every day. If I cross the border and go into Netherlands, they don't accept cash, and so there's a lot of sort of streamlining to be done on that side, I think, before the approach to central bank digital currency can be really sort of ironed out on the European side.
I want to bring in now Eve Lee, who's another one of our stellar students at the Harvard Kennedy School and at the Belfer Center. Eve is pursuing her master's in public policy. She's only 1 year in, so I have her in my clutches for another year to keep working on these issues. And Eve is an expert on consumer privacy issues. So Eve, go ahead.
Thank you, Aditi, and thank you for a wonderful panelists today. My question is for Dante, revolving around privacy issues for Libra. So when the Libra Association announced its plans last year, several data protection as well as privacy enforcement officials have voiced concerns about the Libra's plans for the handling as well as the collection of personal and financial information. So my question is, what policies and what technological design choices is Libra making to make sure to protect user data privacy? And as a second part to that question, with Facebook's digital wallet, which was previously called Libre, recently renamed to Novi, would it be able to use data from the user's social media accounts?
Yeah, thank you, Eve. So needless to say, I think if you've heard a common theme in my remarks so far, it's that, you know, better to get it right than to get it fast, and better to get it harmonized with the regulatory regime and with the social, the need for social license for a network like this to really succeed. And that, of course, includes a very, very deep commitment to privacy at all levels. So, you know, the association is taking a privacy by design approach, which is effectively looking at it from a grounds up level, not only at the code, the technology, but also in the conduct and the governance of the project. It says a lot, for example, that the association is based in Switzerland, so there's a very high standard of consumer privacy and protection in Switzerland. Needless to say, we also recognize that we don't operate in a vacuum of standards like GDPR. Notwithstanding some natural tensions between blockchains and privacy rules around the world and the right to be forgotten, we think these types of issues really, really do matter, and they have to be enshrined in every aspect of the project. So we have and continue to build out this type of work stream before the project goes live, and we'll be able to really abide by a very high standard around consumer protection and privacy. And then, you know, a Facebook question, of course, I can't answer, but the posture that all the wallet operators and all the operators on the network would take is a posture in which these types of standards are being pushed down across the network so that good actors are effectively incented and incentivized to use the network correctly, and that bad actors are being pushed out. And that would include people who have, you know, illicit motives in terms of financial activity and are, you know, misusing privacy and consumer privacy and protection standards. We don't want the Libre system to be a place where any type of bad actor can thrive. There's plenty of places in the global financial system for bad conduct, and this network is not really being designed to be one of those.
Can I just push you on that, Dante? The Libra Association is comprised of many organizations in addition to Facebook, but Facebook is developing a digital wallet, Novi, and will the digital wallet be able to access users' social media data?
Yeah, so what David Marcus, Novi's head, has said in the past on this issue, and you know, I suppose he would continue to hold this posture, is that Novi has been structured as a completely new entity, wholly owned nonetheless, but a new entity within Facebook, and that, you know, the segregation, a very clear firewall between social data and financial data has been established for that very reason. You know, and people who would want to use a Novi wallet to use the payment system would have to set up a completely new account to do so. So that's the last sort of reported posture publicly, and there has been nothing that I'm aware of that's different from that. And again, like any financial network, any payment system network, the trade-off of what is minimally viable in terms of data to consummate a transaction versus what becomes potentially risky information from a consumer point of view. These are standards that are pretty hardened, especially on the other side of the Atlantic when it comes to privacy requirements.
Okay. Thanks, Dante. Let me extend that question to David. David, okay, what are the implications of the digital yuan for domestic surveillance in China?
I think this two different issues. So in the digital yuan, as in Libra, and there will be regulation and especially KYC requirement. So that means when you to open a digital wallet for digital yuan, you need to submit your personal information such as your identity or your mobile number or your social security number in China. But this is not just fully and you don't need to fully and disclose your personal information. There will be a different layer of KYC requirement and corresponding to different limitations on your digital wallet. For example, if you go to the bank branch to open a wallet, and you take your ID card with you, and the bank staff do the KYC check, and there will be no limitation on your wallet. However, if you just download a wallet from Apple Store and not linked to your ID number or your mobile numbers, you will have very very limited amount you can own in the wallet. But all the information regarding to KYC and will go to the central bank. But the central bank, for central bank to do the anti-monetary laundering regulations, but the information will be kept in the central bank. But central bank will protect your rights of anonymous payment if you do it in legal ways. So it won't be a kind of monitoring tools in China. Yeah, and besides, even with the introduction of the digital yuan, there will still be cash, physical cash in China. People can own and use cash. Yeah.
Is that the plan, David, that they would not phase out physical cash?
Yes, they will not phase out digital physical cash. There's no plan to phase out physical cash. Yeah.
Okay. Julia, one of the motivations for central bank digital currencies that emerging markets usually offer, and the Bank of International Settlements has done surveys on this, and emerging market participants usually cite financial inclusion as a major reason to look into digital currencies. It seems like even in the US, the conversation has shifted in that direction in light of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about the implications of a digital currency to promote financial inclusion here in the US?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's certainly, what this crisis has highlighted is that the surprising lack of access to formal financial services. We knew that was true, right? You know that there are many individuals out there who do not have a formal bank account. Some countries have a sort of a legal right to a bank account, like in France, right? You have a sort of constitutional right to a bank account. That's not true in the United States. And there are many sort of conditions under which one might not have that kind of access. At the same time, we also have to consider, and I saw a message pop up at the bottom here about cell phone ownership. That's also an access to the internet. That's something that I think that perhaps weighs on the other side. And so I think that we'll really have to look carefully at the spreadsheets here and see sort of what, as we introduce something like this, whether we actually see broader participation in the financial sector and an ability to establish a credit record, for example, and other things that can be sort of a hurdle in the United States.
Dante, the Libra Association has offered financial inclusion as one of the main pros of the Libra token. Can you talk about how Libra would achieve that goal?
Sure. I think there's, in the aggregate, there are a couple of ways of flipping the story on its head a little bit, right? That, you have 1.7 billion people without a bank account, 1.3 billion who are underbanked. It's a globally systemic reality for far too many people. And I think, as Julia has been pointing out throughout the conversation today, also a real challenge here in the United States. And yet of that number, the 1.7 billion, a billion people have access to a $30 internet-enabled mobile phone. And so the key is that if the internet-enabled mobile phone can become a regulated payment endpoint, then you have an opportunity to do what projects like M-Pesa have done in Kenya, where over M-Pesa's life cycle, you had high 80% rates of people being unbanked and underbanked to switching the script entirely to virtually all of the population having access to the system, even if it is for something so basic as a payment. That's the beginning of financial mobility and economic empowerment. If you cannot get paid frequently, at low cost, reliably, it's very hard to pull people up the spectrum of economic mobility. So I think that what Libre is trying to do, and bear in mind, Libre is open source. We want to promote a lot of vigorous competition on this network. We want users and developers, banks and other operators to be able to leverage this as common good. And that's one of the ways we think we'll have a direct impact there. And the other piece of the puzzle is that the network is being designed to support incredibly low cost payments, user-directed payments, peer-to-peer payments that are open and don't lock you into one provider or another, where the death by 1,000 cuts begin to emerge when you consider today's payment standards.
Dante, there have been solutions offered on this question of financial inclusion before, prepaid debit cards and things like that. There was a Brookings paper that came out recently that talked about bridging the digital cash divide. How does Libra actually help people do that? Because at the end of the day, even if you get a paycheck, you still need to convert it to Libra tokens somewhere, right? And so is Libra going to offer bank branches? Like, where do you go to get into the digital system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where it's also compelling to think about the type of diversity in the ecosystem, not only implied by the types of organizations that are members of the association, but implied by the fact that a network that could reach the types of economies of scale that we're hoping to reach is that you'll have around it a range of different providers and operators, on and off ramps, exchanges, the ability for people to have contactless payments in commerce without having to cash in or cash out. So there's a whole host of use cases that are obviously in our foundational year, this being the year we're aiming to get licensed and turn the network on, are hard to envision today. But when you fast forward 3 or 5 years from today, you could start to envision an entire ecosystem that also might potentially include things like, commercial transaction for farmers. Groups like Heifer International are members of the association, a lot of very deeply committed organizations focused on financial inclusion and last mile use cases are part of the project for good reason, because we know we don't have all the answers, and a lot of the points that have been raised about conditions precedent to financial inclusion, such as access to the internet, the access of identity systems that are universal and portable, are also really massively important conditions precedent. But we think that we create an economic incentive for a lot of innovation around all of these issues, not just the case for payments.
Thanks, Dante. There are a host of questions in the Q&A about just the global nature of designing the digital currency architecture. So maybe, Julia, I can start with a question for you. As the ECB thinks about this, and if you go to our digital currency tracker, you will see that in addition to the Euro-wide effort, there are several nation-specific efforts happening in the European Union to talk about digital currencies. How does this work with the euro? And is it going to reignite old debates about the euro as a currency for that region?
I hope not. I hope that this can actually be something, and I think I mentioned earlier, I hope this can be something to actually strengthen the case for it. I think we always say, that a strong euro and a strong eurozone economy is really of national security and sort of economic priority for the United States. And so I think that, honestly, Aditi, I don't see it being as a trigger for leaving the eurozone. I think that if you there are a lot of other aspects that could trigger those debates, such as all the different integration efforts and who's in a banking crisis when. You've seen that throughout the course of the eurozone crisis, but I don't think that this particular thing would be the trigger.
A question for David. China is probably the furthest ahead on all of this. Do you see a scenario in which China develops this digital currency architecture and then is able to offer it to emerging markets and other countries that might be interested in having their own digital currency, but would rather just import the architecture for it?
Yes, I think this is possible, yeah. But we also need to see that for the central bank digital currency, it is not just technical problems. So basically, because for the central bank digital currency, it derives its value from sovereign support, and it must be interoperative with current monetary and payment systems. And it also needs to follow into the regulations of the local government. So there will be lots of technology and cooperations, but there will have no implication for monetary sovereignty. Yeah.
Right. I raise that because obviously here in the United States, we're having a lot of discussions about technology dependence, and telecommunications is top of mind, 5G infrastructure, and whether we want to utilize Chinese companies in our tech infrastructure. And I wonder if we're heading towards a similar debate in the digital currency space.
I don't think so, because if you look at the central bank digital currency of other countries, for example, Singapore and Canada, they use lots of open source blockchain platforms like Ethereum and Hyperledgers. And Libre is also open source. So if you look at the Chinese digital currencies, all the patents are open to the public. I don't think there will be technical dependent issues in the future. Yeah.
Julia, what are your views on that? Is this something that the USG is thinking about?
Yeah, and I think that they should. I think that you can't view these issues in isolation. I mean, the role of the U.S. dollar, the role of any currency is, been shown that, it plays a role in our geopolitics. There's certainly the U.S. dollar is a tool of economic statecraft, as we always discuss. I mean, you alluded to sanctions policy earlier. And so I think that there really are, there are elements that are going to have to be considered here. Technological access provides access for other parts of, either on the private side, from the sort of illicit AML CFT side, but then also from state control and elements of those governments. And so I think that not to say that that's the way I look at this issue set, but I would say that there will be conversations within the U.S. government that sort of look at how the telecommunications debates and what we've sort of learned there as this goes forward.
Dante, staying on this theme of the global work that needs to be done here, to the extent that Libra will operate in many different countries, how do you think about compliance for an international currency, given different compliance standards around the world? Is the solution adhering to the strictest laws in each country you operate in?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Aditi, and obviously, we don't need a race to the bottom. I think, if anything, the blockchain sector and this digital currency space to have gone from something that was originally, if you ask a crypto utopian or a crypto anarchist, it was originally designed to compete against centralized forms of value and governance and so on. The fact that it is now a technology that is not only informing 70% of the world's central banks and their thinking around digitizing their own assets and so on, it says a lot about how far the technology has come. And I think it's a space that is broadly looking for certainty and looking for regulatory clarity. And I think one of the secondary sort of positive benefits of the Libre project, we're working very closely with the Financial Stability Board and many others, is about how do we harmonize global standards around a range of issues relating to this type of asset class, such that its true opportunity can be unlocked of empowering people, not just in payments, but across a realm of areas. Blockchain technology really has a lot to add to the world across a range of different sort of use cases, from identity and so on. So I'm compelled, but I don't think we gain anything if this becomes a race to the bottom and a big arbitrage opportunity. There's plenty of places, again, in the traditional economy in which you can shortchange and cut corners. And for this asset class to really work, we can't afford that model.
Thank you. Let me go now to each of your closing comments on this topic. I'm sure we could talk for hours, but we only have 3 minutes left. And maybe one thing you could address in your closing comments is the time frame in which you see, to the extent that you see, the US launching a digital dollar, Europe launching a digital euro, and of course Libra to be widely launched. So maybe I'll start with you, Julia, and then go to Dante and David.
I certainly don't have a crystal ball. I know that it's not only a question of what, and this is something I should mention also, it's not only a question of what the US government would like sees or what the Federal Reserve sees, but also our Congress will play a big role in sort of our Financial Services Committee, and we'll certainly have to answer them to as well. So there's going to be a lot of push and pull there as well. I think we're looking pretty fast. I wouldn't, you know, I think that the impetus, the fire has been lit, as I mentioned, you know, just the as what's highlighted by the currency tracker on one side and COVID on the other. I think for us, it's really going to be a balance between, you know, all of the benefits here, but then also the, you know, the AML CFT aspect, which I admit, you know, plays a big role in how we look at this. You know, you can, both of you can say that shouldn't be true, but that's sort of the way it is. And I think that reflects, you know, just generations of seeing how the dollar can be misused, and then what we need to do to protect it in the past. And so I think that there will continue to be a strong emphasis on that side going forward, and justifiably.
All right, thanks, Julia. Dante, your quick thoughts?
My quick thoughts. We are aiming for getting the Libre network licensed by the end of 2020, and hopefully with that thereafter, there's a very vibrant ecosystem around it that facilitates greater access to payments for billions of people.
Thank you. David, your final thoughts?
Okay, yeah. So even the Chinese central bank is working very hard on the digital yuan project. There is no committed timetable for the digital yuan. So the central bank will thoroughly test the digital yuan to make sure its benefit for the financial inclusion and financial stability. So I think the central bank will leave no stone untouched and before the implementation of the digital yuan, and also for the cross-border or overseas adoption of digital yuan. And the Chinese central bank will use a cooperative rather than intrusive approach. So that means if there is a very large market demand for digital yuan in foreign countries, the Chinese government will work with the foreign countries to respect its monetary sovereignty. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you, Julia and Dante and David, for an excellent panel. We hope to continue the conversation. Thank you to all of those who tuned in. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day. Yeah. Bye-bye.